Same-sex relationships, a first-century perspective, blah, blah, blah. HTS Theological Studies, blah, blah, blah. Same-sex relationships, a first-century perspective. William Loader, Emeritus Professor in New Testament, Murdoch University, Australia, Department of New Testament Studies, University of Pretoria, South Africa, whatever. Correspond abstract, read in the light of other Jewish literature of the time, not least Philo of Alexandria. Paul's comments in Romans 1 about same-sex relations should be seen as a rhetorical ploy to gain a sympathetic hearing for his argument from the Roman recipients of his letter by appealing to common ground and deploring the sins of the Gentile world before turning to challenge them about the fact that they have sinned and so need the good news of God's righteousness revealed in Christ. Typically, Paul's focus is not just acts, but attitude and misdirected passions, which he sees as the result of misdirected and perverted understandings of God. Based on the Genesis creation stories, Paul assumes that all people are heterosexual and that the prohibitions of Leviticus should apply also to lesbian relations. Where these assumptions are not shared, Paul's conclusions must be revisited in the light of informed compassion and responsible ethical insight. So is what he trying to say that it's a rhetorical ploy of that whole idea that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God? And this silly idea that every act and everything is sin, so that you need Jesus, and it's appalling. It is somewhat fortuitous that we have in the New Testament some reference to same-sex relations. We have this because Paul wanted to cite what he could assume his hearers would most agree with him in condemning. He does so in order to introduce his argument that in fact all people fall under God's condemnation, not only those Gentiles but also Jews. He packs very much into the four relevant verses in Romans 1, 24, 26 to 28, but leaves much unexplained because it needed no explanation. Fortunately, he is not the only Jew of his time to address the issue, and other Jews were not so terse. I have discussed Jewish literature, Loader 2007, 9, 11a, 11b, 2012, 20, blah, blah, Greco-Roman literature, blah, blah, and New Testament literature on the theme in extensive detail elsewhere. Really? Philo of Alexandria. Our best resource for extensive Jewish comment is Paul's contemporary, Philo of Alexandria, who happily engages at the interface of Jewish and Hellenistic Roman culture in a way that enables us to recognize perspectives informing his thought from both sources. Whilst we cannot assume that Alexandria's Philo and Tarsus's Paul would have necessarily shared the same perspective in such matters, it is clear that they have much in common, so that Philo provides a helpful entry into the biblical texts. He has the advantage of not being considered inspired and authoritative, and so being less laden with the distorting hopes and fears which that brings. In his account of the therapeutes, mostly people of senior age, men and women who live in celibacy on the shores of Lake Mareotis near Alexandria in reflection and contemplation, Philo contrasts the holy feasts with the unholy parties of his day. For while there, he writes, are slaves of the utmost comeliness and beauty, giving the idea that they have come not so much to render service as to give pleasure to the eyes of the beholders by appearing on the scene. Contempt 50. He then describes some who are still boys and others full-grown lads fresh from the bath and smooth shaven, with their faces smeared with cosmetics and paint under the eyelids, and the hair of the head prettily plaited and tightly bound. Contempt 50, similarly described in whatever that is, Spec 3.37. In the background are others, grown lads, newly bearded, with the down just blooming on their cheeks, recently pets of the pederasts, elaborately dressed up for the heaviest services, proof of the opulence of the hosts as those who employ them know, but in reality of their bad taste. Contempt 52. He goes on to describe the gluttony and drunkenness typical of such occasions and the sexual profligacy which ensues. Contempt 53 to 56, blah 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 blah. Elsewhere he describes the men at such parties as typically engaging in indiscriminate sex with both women and men or boys. He describes the men of Sodom similarly as engaged in both in adultery and in mounting other men, as he puts it. Already we see three important elements in Philo's discussion. One, same-sex acts happen primarily in wild drunken parties. They are simply part of profligate sexual response. The same men also engage in adultery. Similarly, Josephus, blah blah, and blah blah, blah blah blah. Philo of Alexandria. I forget who the hell that was. Read in the light of other Jewish literature of the time, not least Philo of Alexandria, Paul's comments in Romans 1 about same-sex relations should be seen as a rhetorical ploy to gain a sympathetic hearing for his argument from the Roman recipients of his letter by appealing to common ground and deploring the sins of the Gentile world before turning to challenge them about the fact that they have all sinned and blah blah blah. Philo of Alexandria. Spooky.